So the Christian evidences is what we've been studying, which you've got a lot of facets, I guess, you could work out from Christian evidences, kind of doing an overview of some broad areas. This is the section that we're on, this the morality, using morality as a reason for the existence of God. I think David talked about last time the other little areas that we were talking about. Can you remember any of them? Ooh, those are connected. Not words that we use every day. Remember the teleological? And what was the other one? Y'all got your books in front of you, can use them. Cosmological. There, is that right? And then we'll just call that one moral. It's easier to write. So see, I think I've got them written down in my book here. So the cosmological, I mean, this is John's simplification. Sorry, I don't have a PhD in philosophy, but I would boil it down to, with such a great effect, there had to be a great cause. You've got to have a sufficient cause for what we see around us. The universe is big. I mean, just our planet is hard to get your mind around. What could cause that? But it's more than just our planet, isn't it? I mean, you've got our whole solar system. You've got our whole galaxy. You got, when they first launched the Hubble telescope, one of the first things they wanted to do was go into this dark region of space and see if they could see anything. For a long time, I had it on my computer at work, and so they came back with this picture, and look at all the little stars, and you look a little closer, and they're not stars. They're galaxies. It's just dotted with galaxies. I mean, the universe is gigantic. There are stars that our solar system would fit inside. I mean, the power for such an effect, you had to have a great cause. And the scientists say, well, there was an explosion. Oh, don't mean to advance that. That kind of tees into the next one. The cosmological is really looking at the design, right? The old example is, you walk along the beach and you find a watch, and you think, well, how did that evolve out of the sand? That's not what you think. You think, somebody dropped their watch. It didn't just appear. I mean, I knew that. I've got I guess my best pair of pliers that I like, I found in the sand. A little rusty, but they're a good pair of pliers. I know they didn't just form out of the sand. Lightning didn't strike and it was molten. No, they're designed. They're manufactured. They had a designer. Some little guy got on his computer and designed it, or however he did it. There was a designer behind that. It's evident from it. And then the last one is the existence of morality. And you would say, well, our morality is pretty low. Well, I'm not arguing whether our morality is good or bad. But as you see from this slide, and we talked a little bit last time, if you remember, we talked about, and it's kind of the basic example, I guess, is the Nazi Germany. And when you had the trials after the war was over, so the Nazi leaders were on trial for what they had done, their atrocities. And they're like, well, we're doing what our government said we should do. That was the law. Our leaders said, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we did. We loaded people up in train cars, and we shipped them somewhere, and when we put them in, said, you're going to go in here and take a shower, and we closed the doors, and we pumped gas in there, and we killed them, and then we did it again, and then we did that again, and they're saying that was our That was our law. That was our law we were under. So there, Nuremberg it kind of came together there. They're saying that your law, there's a higher law than your law, than your country law. They're saying you can't judge us by British law. You can't judge us by American law. And to an extent, that's right. I mean, like the speed limit here has no effect on what the speed limit is in Germany if you're pulled over. But in Germany, he doesn't care what the speed limit is in Germany. You know, you're not on the Autobahn, sir. Maybe you've heard that. I don't know. I guess I don't have a speed limit in Autobahn. My sister's been on it. I haven't. But there's a higher law above that. And you remember the chart? And there was a supreme law. There was God's law at the top. Then you had, German law and English law or American law. And so we're under, don't turn off. We're under a higher law. Well, not just the existence of a higher law, but also one of the proofs is that there's progress that can be measured, right? And we think of it that time, we think, oh, things have really gone downhill since, or things have gotten so much better since. Well, how are you measuring that progress? How do you measure any progress? You'd say, well, the TV's moved 3 inches to the right since last time. Well, how do you know that? Well, you'd have to get your tape measure and you'd see right there, that tape measure, there's your standard, right? You had some kind of measuring device. See, the TV moved, and I'm sure because I measured it. Well, the measuring device would be a higher standard, higher than our own laws in the Nazi example.
John?
Yes, sir.
Sure. We have a higher law inside of our brains, every human being does. My stepmother, was German. She spent her time growing up as a teenager in Germany. One day she came out of her house and she looked down the road and the Gestapo had stopped at a Jewish couple. They were an old couple. And she knew something was wrong about that old couple being put in prison. It went against German law, but she knew there was something wrong. And
that's what happened to the German law, right? It changed. And he's got 1933. I don't know my World War II history that well, but when Hitler came into power, things changed. And so we would say there was a digression there, right? Of their morality was here, and it moved down here. And then we would say after World War II, we would say there was an improvement. And it's back up here. Now they're our allies, right? And we're buddies with Germany. The same with Japan. Isn't that right? In 1940, you probably weren't buying many Japanese goods. But now they're buying Japanese stuff. There's been an improvement in the morality. But that's what this slide is saying. If you can measure degeneration or improvement, then you've got to have a standard by which you're doing that. If you look at a society on this side of the world and say, well, they used to be really bad, but they have improved, then there has to be a universal standard by which you're measuring that. It was an interesting article that Dr. Light sent with me. It's actually not an article, I guess. It's from a chapter on, I can't get this to stay awake, on values in human thought and action, which is a class at Freed Hardeman. I think he taught values for many years. So part of morality, and we'll talk about it some this morning, and y'all are welcome to make comments, but is the conscience. So you got to deal with how the conscience works when you're talking about morality. I know you tend to think about, well, what about Ted Bundy or some wild example, but in general, people have a conscience. So I like this statement here. I highlighted this. Though the conscience functions as a voice of authority concerning our moral obligations, the conscience is not a determinant of the content of morality. Knowledge of the specific content of morality respecting moral obligation is dependent on God's revelation to man. Let me read that one more time. Though the conscience functions as a voice of authority concerning our moral obligations, the conscience is not a determinant of the content of morality. knowledge of the specific content of morality respecting moral obligation is dependent on God's revelation to man. So one aspect when you talk about morality is your conscience. Doug?
I'm just going to talk about, a person's conscience can change.
Right.
You can, over time, based on exterior influences and so forth. So we have to be careful about that.
I think that's right, and I struggled with this in my less than one day of preparation for this class. And this is what I came up with. So this is welcome to be picked at if you wish. I was trying to think of it this way. I was thinking of girls in the back had a seesaw. It's still standing, sort of. Looks like conscience, doesn't it? I thought of it this way, with your conscience as the teeter-totter, and this fulcrum as your intellect, or your information, if you will. How do you spell intellect? That's a bad thing to ask, isn't it? And so that is, it's informed, and so you might have I'm off to the side there a little bit, so how would that work? If you have good and you have bad, and your conscience will then weigh that out. And what you have informed yourself with will be how well you do that. Now, if you're well informed and in the center, then this is going to perform correctly, right? But you could have this really poorly informed and be over here and not be in balance. Or you could have something really bad that you approve of. Or even, you've been taught wrong. You had your parents that had a boy that grew up next door to us, I guess both parents, maybe just the father, but, just cursed every other word. And so that little boy, at 3 years old, would curse like nobody you'd ever met. He didn't know what he was saying, but he would say it. So he was just poorly informed. And so that made then poor decisions that he was making on what he would say. So there is some aspect that we learn, and we change over time as we get better information down here. And part of the argument in this chapter is, your information needs to come from God's Word, and ultimately that is the source of our morality. And that's really where it comes around to the existence of God, is how else are you going to argue why people have that morality at all? You think of a cheetah out in Africa, and he's hunting an antelope, and he catches it and he eats it. He doesn't spend a lot of time thinking, that poor family that lost a granddad here, or whoever it was that he's eating. It doesn't bother him. There's no conscience about what he has done. Whereas a person that has information, and not that your conscience keeps you from making bad decisions, but it's going to inform you, you did something wrong there. Think of David in the Old Testament, right? The conscience that he had didn't keep him from sinning with Bathsheba or sending Uriah to his death, having him carry the letter himself. Does that make it worse? Maybe it does for his own death. But the conscience was still in there. It didn't keep him, it didn't form his decisions for him, but it let him reflect on that and think, yeah, I was the man. You're right. It let him able to accept the teaching later on.
The Bible talks about our conscience being seared with a hot iron. There's a lot of people that they have conscience, but events in their lives can make that go back and forth. Fear, fear of your government, fear of your boss at work, or fear of what the community's gonna think about you, or whatever. It goes back and forth too easily, really, especially if you're not grounded in the Word of God.
Yeah, Jeremiah said it a long time ago, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself." How's that end up? "It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps." Right. We've heard that verse before. Think about what that's saying. It's not in man, not in himself, to direct his steps.
And there's a way that seemeth right to a man, but
In there ever the ways of death. That's right. And that's kind of the idea that we're talking about, that our morality, our right and wrong, comes from above, from God. And there's pushbacks against that, and we'll get to that a little bit, where people say, well, no, it's instinct or it's sociological pressures. But there's some continuing things. We'll talk about that when we get to that point. This first slide just talks about how that there's got to be an objective standard, and we talked about that just a little bit. Again, to the existence of God, and this is the philosophical way of stating that. There can be real moral progress and moral generation, and if you got an objective standard by which to measure those things, and if you have an objective standard, then God exists. Then, therefore, God does exist because you have the standard. Anyway, so this is kind of the chart, and this is kind of similar. I don't know why that looks like it has extra forks in it there, but anyway. Again, about the German people there is kind of your traditional example, and it's I really can't explain. I know that Hitler had a lot of charisma. How he was able to get a nation to buy into that, into what happened. It's kind of an amazing thing. You're saying, well, that would never happen. Well, it did happen.
I think a lot of it was national pride. Germany had been, sort of down as far as
Right.
economically and all. I think it was national pride and a cult of personality like Hitler.
We're working together. He rode that way very successfully. The pushback against the reparations from World War I, which largely we paid. But anyway.
You feed on people's grievances
Right.
and evil,
But-
rolls into evil.
But you would think that wouldn't happen, that people wouldn't be so easily led down a path of let's destroy this whole race. Let's destroy all the handicapped people. How does that get past the committee, right? I mean, how does that get traction? You got your loved one and they're mentally challenged, and let's kill them off. How do you sign off on that? I mean, how do you get?
You certainly don't if you've got somebody in your family.
Right.
Yes, I mean,
But it was somebody's family. That's what I'm saying. I didn't write down the old saying. Y'all have heard that, where it's they came for the Jews and it didn't bother me, and they came for and then they came for me, and nobody was left to say, wait a minute, don't get him.
but there's a lot of different ways to not do right by challenge, mentally or physically challenged people. I mean, you need to provide resources that they need, and all the governments need to keep that in mind too.
Yeah.
They don't always.
There's people in non-ideal circumstances. I know I'm in the way for some of y'all, but just the example of how this happened, and then this higher law, which transcends the specific time period of World War II, or even the German people, and I got my extra forks in there. But this is the standard, and that standard then comes from God. That's how this goes back to the proof of the existence of God. I think Brother Light calls this whole thought moral oughtness. I think he's used that phrase before, that things that you ought to do, things that you feel compelled to do. And so that compulsion, just wants to go to sleep every 3 minutes, doesn't it? That compulsion then is what he's leaning on. Another page in this little chapter from Values is talking about the consciousness that we have of our own moral experience. In other words, that we realize that we have moral struggles or even moral recognition is the first thing to consider. And I thought about, the cheetah, eating an antelope. It doesn't bother him at all. There's no moral experience there. I couldn't help but think of our cat that we used to have, was afraid of her reflection in the mirror. Her own reflection. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of self-awareness there that's you, idiot, that's you. But we do have self-awareness. And the chapter here, I won't read it, but he talks about how that you can doubt. You can doubt a lot of things. You can doubt almost anything. You can doubt it. but you can't doubt that you exist. Because you know that. You're here and you experience things. And part of that existence is your moral experience, your identification that I have things that morally feel good and morally feel bad, that whole sense. And he writes here that all men have the moral experience of feeling obligated in a certain way, and this sense of moral obligation is connected with God. And you can say, all men? All men. All men have a conscience. Now, you could argue that there are some that have some kind of psychological problem, but all men have a conscience. They have this moral experience. So I didn't know this, but like that sound. We call it religion, which has a Latin background. Sorry, I'm in the way no matter which way I stand. So ligion, you can almost hear that, right? You've got ligaments in your body that connect the bones together. And it gets tendons that connect the muscles, and ligaments that connect the bones. And this is tying back, and it's tying back to God. That's what religion means. That's where the word comes from in the Latin.
I don't think we can discount Satan's influence either. I mean,
Right.
going about like a roaring lion, and I think he knows where we are the weakest, and that is where he will attack us.
And I think one aspect of Satan that's interesting, but you're correct. But he's also not omnipresent. I think there's times that he's really after you, and the times that maybe it's a little bit lighter.
And we are given the tools to resist him.
And it is the word. I mean, if you think you can beat him without this, you're mistaken about that. He's smarter than you are. No offense to anyone here. He's old, right? He's got knowledge, and he doesn't know everything about us, but he knows a lot. He was sure Job would cave, wasn't he? Job will cave if I poke him hard enough, he'll cave. But God's like, have you considered my servant Job?
And Satan, he knows there's a God, and he knows the Bible. Where you have people who say that God doesn't exist, Satan knows he exists.
Yeah. He's
Even the devils believe and tremble.
Yeah, the reaction to Jesus, when you read the Gospels is always interesting to me. They're just quivering. I mean, they knew who they were talking to, but most of the people sure didn't. So there is, when you say the word religion in itself, that reflects the bond that we have of moral obligation. We're bound back. I thought of it kind of like an elastic band, that you pull against it and it's drawing you back. And when we pull against it, we can feel the pull of God saying, don't do that. I don't want you to do that. It's against the commands that I've given you. So we've got a conscience, and that kind of works. Now, it's not infallible. Again, our information may not be correct. But if we have filled our heart and mind with this book, it's going to be a whole lot more correct. And we can't fill ourselves perfectly. But with this as our guide, we're going to be in the middle, and we can trust our conscience. You want me to say, I can't do that. We're going to say things like, we ought to obey God rather than men. Even though the government is telling you to do something else, you can say, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. And that helps us make decisions of morality. Let's see what our next slide is. So David has this proposition here. If at least one human being has a sense of moral obligation that cannot be explained except on the basis of God, then God exists. He says, well, there is at least one human being who has that sense of moral obligation, therefore God exists. Again, that's morality as an evidence of God. That's maybe not as sciencey is not a word, but as these other two, where you look at these scientific proofs of the angle of the earth and the moon and all that stuff, or even how DNA works and all those things. But it is a proof, and it is something that the atheists have to deal with. I'd highlighted this little section, that all persons can expect the conscience to urge one to do what one has judged to be right. And that's even if they've got a lot of bad information. Still, the conscience itself works according to what they have informed themselves as what is right and wrong. You might go to another a society, and maybe it's cannibalism, something extreme, right? And they're like, it's okay to eat our neighbors or whatever. But according to their conscience won't bother them if their information is that far off to the side. And this from Romans chapter 2, I thought was interesting, talking about the whole thing about conscience and your intellect and your information. So you can turn to this if you'd like. This is Romans 2, 14 and 15. Romans 2, 14 and 15. I don't know what version this is. I'm just reading it from the paper here. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. Kind of saying here that saying that the Gentiles didn't have a revealed law. They didn't have the law revealed to them the way that the Jews had. It was given to the Jewish people, but they had a law unto themselves, this moral law, this obligation to keep a moral law. And again, that's coming from God based on what God would have them to do. You could make some... Ooh, that's hard to see, isn't it? Sorry, I think it was done in PowerPoint, and I'm opening it up in another version. But what this is supposed to say, let's see if I've got a chart that looks better. This is slide 58, I think, on page 20 in your book. Think about just a situation, whatever it may be. Your examples sometimes are a little extreme. Think of you're walking down the road and there's a house there, and you notice that there's smoke and it appears to be on fire, and there's a child in the window. You don't know the child, you don't know these people, but you see a child, second floor, and the house looks like it's on fire. There's smoke, and the child's help. So the chart here is kind of saying, well, you've got at least two things going on. You can say, I need to go save that child. I don't know who it is. Well, they need help, right? Maybe they're trapped for whatever reason. And the other thing would be, I don't want to go in a burning house. I could die in there. And that's true, isn't it? One big of smoke, and you're a big, tough man, and you're going to be on the floor after that smoke, and you will die in that house. Regardless of what Hollywood thinks you're going to do, that big lung of smoke is going to put you down. And so you're making a moral decision there. And in his article, he says that you're choosing between, he even goes this down to your instinct would be, first instinct is, I don't want to go in that house. I could die in there. That's self-preservation, right? You try not to do things that would hurt yourself unless you're what kind of extreme sports do you do, Gabe? You don't jump out of planes, bungee jump. Don't? Okay. Anybody in here bungee jumped? Oh my goodness. I could not do that. Things that you think or parachutists, that's a natural instinct you are overcoming. I would grip a hold of those bars right by the door. Someone would have to get me out of there. Because you're going against your natural instinct to survive. Because I'm putting my life in danger doing this. So there's your self-preservation. But also you have you might think, if I don't save the child, people will say, well, why didn't you save the child? So there's like a community pressure, right? A sociological pressure. That's my job. I'm an adult. I should save the child. And there you go. So there's self-preservation and maybe even your sociological training, that's an important thing you should do. You're here to help. You should go do something. And you're weighing those out. So in the article, I won't do a good job of summarizing it, but he kind of says, he agrees there's your instinct and then your sociological side. He said that's not where the morality is. The morality is you're picking between the two, right? That's what the morality is. You're picking, self-preservation? How big is the fire? Or what is the expectation? Did you see that fire? Yeah, I was there in the yard. I watched it burn. I called 911 and sat down there and waited. You did what? I got my phone out and I called. You saw him in the window? Yeah. So you're weighing that out in your mind. What's my moral decision I'm going to make? Now, I'm not telling you what you're going to do there. You could go in the house and die. You could sit there and call 911 and wait. But the whole aspect of you making a decision between those two things is your morality, something that you live with after that.
John, do you think, and this is probably don't have enough class time for us, so we can move on, it don't matter. Do you think, or do you think that the Holy Spirit has anything to do with our conscience or our moral direction? Because in that scenario, let's take the baby out of the burning building and put it in the womb.
Yeah.
It's the same philosophy. And you take Hitler. Hitler actually believed in God.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think he was psycho, actually.
Yeah, he was.
Well, he did. He had a mental
Yeah.
illness, and he had people follow that, whatever. But do you think, your opinion on do you think the Holy Spirit has anything to do with our conscience or our moral? I know it is because of reading and studying, yes. That's how we get the intellect on the seesaw.
I mean, my personal opinion, I think that's aligning this in the proper way. That's what I think. I mean, it's without the scriptures to guide us, we're making it up as we go.
John,
Sir?
seems like to me our conscience is God-given, but it must be trained.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts by our parents at a very early age. I mean, down where I was raised, our conscience was trained a lot by little Hickory Limb. The training is on and on and on from the time of birth until we get this thing in our mind. If we make a decision, our conscience is going to say, well, is it good? Is it allowed? Or is it bad? It is disallowed. But it all happens because God gave us a conscience. But if it's left alone, it's not going to be any benefit to us when we're making decisions.
And it is a guide for us in making decisions, but it's not going to keep you from making bad decisions, unfortunately. I think that conscience hurting you is what's going to keep your heart sensitive enough to say, I need to repent of that. And that's where it's helping you, because it's going to keep bothering you, isn't it? And that's keeping your heart tender. It just struck me. Hannah, our daughter, she calls it Bible time with the little granddaughter, with Rebecca. And so I was telling Tracy, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. She's doing little songs with her, doing, be careful, little mouth, what you say. She can't speak yet. But she's already singing that to her. Be careful, little mouth, what you say. She's starting now. Before she speaks, she's saying, be careful what you say. It just hit me like a ton of bricks the other day. And that training, you can try starting here. That ain't going to work. That ain't going to work. You can't say, well, I'll just let them free range. They'll just be wild, feral. That's not going to work. Their idea of God really comes from The parents. If God is your father and you don't know what a father does, your idea of God isn't going to be very good either. I'm just saying that's a formative thing. Your idea of what your Heavenly Father should be can come a lot from your parents. So again, you can have moral disagreement. Again, I was saying that's different between different cultures. You may have a culture that says, well, you can eat your neighbor because you're a cannibal, or you can't because you're friendly to people. And so that would be like an objection saying, well, you can't prove the moral argument of God based on not everyone has the same morals. Well, no, they don't. Again, that's just whether or not they're basing it on God's revelation. So that morality should align. Sorry, it keeps turning off there. An instinct, we talked about, the self-preservation instinct, or you might say your morals come from instinct, but it doesn't explain how the conscience works if it's just instinct. True animals don't have that moral compass inside of them making decisions. And then social conditioning, that's the whole social pressure on getting you to behave a certain way. So I wrote this down. You can take it or leave it, but it made me think of social conditioning. Does that explain your behavior 100% or not? And it doesn't. And I just couldn't help but think of this example. One of the history teachers at Freed-Hardeman wrote a book on the history of Freed-Hardeman. Tracy knows this, but one of the incidents that he covered, it wasn't all, some history books are kind of glossing stuff. He wasn't glossing, so I don't know if he was well favored after writing his book. But he said, in the 60s, maybe late 50s, whenever Freed-Hardeman was integrated, there were, whatever it was, first year, 3 or 4 black students at Freed-Hardeman. And so they would go to whoever they were appointed to, their teacher, for their guidance. And the teachers wouldn't talk to them. Their white Christian professor wouldn't speak to them. So word got around the campus, go to Dr. B. Dr. B will help you. So he would. The social pressure was those people aren't acceptable. But that wasn't how he was working. He had a different compass, right? He had this working. He's like, people should be treated like people. And that kind of rang in my head a little bit. Isn't that what the church should be? There's social pressure for us to behave a certain way, but we're like, this is guiding me. I don't know what the rest of y'all are doing, but this book is what's guiding me. And the morality that we have should reflect Jesus' morality. If it doesn't, we're not doing it right. If we're going to be Christ-like Christian, isn't that the word? We should be little reflections of Him. Are we perfect? Not at all. But we're trying, we're polishing. You get that mirror or that window, it's hard to get it clean. You think, what is on this thing? And you keep cleaning and you keep wiping and you keep trying to polish. And the better we clean it, the better we can reflect Him. But it takes some work. It takes some self-awareness and self-consideration. I think that's the last slide that I had. We've got about 4 minutes. Any other thoughts that you'd like to give?
John,
Yes, sir.
an atheist doesn't believe in God because he denies that there's proof. It's because God doesn't fit his preferences, he or she. And so I think we have to be careful even within the church, because there's times where God may not fit what our preferences are. And so we have to be very cautious about that moving forward. But I mean, just speaking to an atheist, most of the time it's not because they don't deny or that they deny the proof of God. It's because it's just truly God doesn't fit
Their lifestyle.
and
Yeah,
morality.
right. Yeah, what they want to do doesn't align with God. And yeah, we have to be careful that we don't, like you said, try to cherry pick our religion and say, well, here, I found a verse that lets me do that. Be careful what you're doing there. This was the last paragraph in this values chapter. He talks about in the mirror of moral obligation, where we're looking at ourselves and what we feel like we should do morally, what we should be doing. When you're looking at moral obligation and conscience, you got these following implications. Here's the summary. He says, 1, you've got a law to which man feels compelled to obey. That is God's commands, God's laws. 2, you've got the reality of God reflected in conscience, and that we even have one, and that it works. Now, it may not work perfectly based on the information. That's a John construct, so that's maybe a subject to failure there. That's how I was thinking about it. And the third thing is you have a personal being exerting moral obligation. That is God. He's trying to put the pressure on us to behave as we should, and we tend to push back, but the more we accept that moral obligation, the more we're in line with God's will. That's all I got this morning. Thank y'all for coming.